The morning sun rose over Ajura, painting the sky in gold as the villagers hurried toward the church. It was Amma and Kojo's wedding day, and the entire community was buzzing with joy. Women in colorful dresses carried baskets of flowers, children ran around excitedly, and the men lined up proudly in their best attire. The church stood glowing, its walls decorated with palm leaves, bright fabrics, and shining candles. Inside, the air was filled with the soft sound of drums and flutes, blending with the priest's gentle hymns. Everyone's eyes sparkled with expectation. Kojo stood at the altar, dressed in a fine suit, his heart pounding as he waited for his bride. He glanced at the doors every few seconds, eager to see her walk in. Families leaned forward in their seats, whispering about how beautiful Amma would look. The women fanned themselves, smiling, and the young girls giggled, imagining their own wedding someday. But as time passed, excitement turned to curiosity. The music played longer than expected, and Amma had still not appeared. Kojo's smile slowly faded into worry. Guests exchanged glances, murmuring questions under their breath. Some suggested she was fixing her gown, others thought nerves had delayed her steps. The priest cleared his throat, looking toward the doors, hoping she would appear soon. The children stopped playing, their laughter replaced with silence as the air grew heavy. The groom's mother clutched her beads, whispering prayers. Whispers turned into a soft wave of unease spreading across the church. Why was the bride taking so long? What could be happening behind those closed doors? Just as people began shifting uncomfortably, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly from outside. Every head turned. The music faltered slightly, the flutes holding a long note. The door creaked, and all eyes widened, waiting for the moment when the bride would finally appear. But no one could guess what sight was about to enter, a moment that would silence laughter and shake the entire village forever. The doors of the church opened slowly, and the crowd leaned forward, eager to see the bride. At first, they saw Amma's glowing white gown, bright as the morning sun, flowing gracefully as she stepped inside. Her veil shimmered, and for a moment, everyone sighed with admiration. But then, the sound came, an iron clank against the floor. The soft dragging echoed through the hall, breaking the beauty of the moment. Gasps filled the air as the people noticed the heavy iron chains locked around her ankles. Each step she took dragged the chains across the polished floor, the harsh sound louder than the music. The drums stopped, the flutes froze mid-note, and the church fell into a thick silence. Amma's face was calm, yet her eyes glistened with hidden pain. She kept her gaze low, holding her bouquet tightly, but the chains betrayed her dignity. The children in the front row clutched their mothers, confused by the strange sight. Some women covered their mouths, tears springing into their eyes, while others turned away, unable to watch. A few young men laughed nervously, their voices quickly shushed by elders who shook their heads in disapproval. Kojo, waiting at the altar, felt his heart stop. His smile disappeared as confusion spread across his face. This was not the bride he had expected, not the moment he had dreamed of. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the chains, struggling to understand. The whispers began like a storm spreading through the church. What kind of bride walked into her own wedding in chains? Was it punishment? A ritual? A curse? Amma's steps grew slower as she moved down the aisle, the chains digging into her skin, but she did not stop. Each clank of iron seemed heavier than the last, filling the church with fear. The once joyful ceremony had turned into something dark and unexplainable. By the time she reached halfway, not a single sound came from the crowd. The silence was complete, broken only by the chains that dragged her dignity with every step. Kojo stood frozen at the altar as Amma moved closer, the sound of her chains echoing through the church. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. This was not the bride he had imagined walking toward him. He had dreamed of her smile, her beauty, her grace, but not this image of pain and humiliation. His eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at the iron shackles biting into her ankles. He had never seen them before, never heard a word about them, and now they appeared on the very day meant to be their happiest. The guests shifted uneasily, their whispers rising like restless waves. Some laughed nervously, unable to handle the weight of the moment, their chuckles sounding out of place in the silent church. Others bowed their heads, murmuring prayers, fearing that what they were witnessing was an omen of something dark. A few women began to cry quietly, their tears falling as they wondered what kind of curse would bring such shame on a bride. The children clung to their mothers, frightened by the strange sight, while the elders exchanged worried glances. Kojo's hands trembled as he reached slightly forward, then pulled back, unsure of what to do. His mind raced with questions. Why had no one told him? Was this some cruel tradition? Was Amma in danger? He searched her face desperately, but her eyes avoided his, glistening with silent tears. His heart ached, wanting to protect her, but his feet refused to move. The priest cleared his throat, his voice dying in the heavy silence. The tension in the church grew unbearable. Every chain that dragged on the floor struck Kojo's heart like a hammer. He felt the eyes of the entire village on him, waiting to see his reaction, waiting to judge. But all he could do was stand there, frozen, torn between love and fear, between disbelief and the terrible reality unfolding before him. He had no answers, only a growing dread that this day was not just a wedding, but the beginning of something much darker. Every eye in the church turned slowly toward the back, where Amma's father, Kwaku Mensa, stood tall and unmoving. His dark eyes were fixed on his daughter, and his face carried a stern, unreadable expression. He looked neither ashamed nor surprised, almost as if he had expected this moment, almost as if he himself had placed the heavy chains around her ankles. His broad shoulders were stiff, his hands clasped behind his back, and his presence filled the room like a shadow stretching over everyone. The guests began to whisper louder, their voices sharp with confusion. "Did he do this?" one woman muttered under her breath. "Why would a father bring such shame to his own child?" another asked. The words passed quickly from mouth to mouth, spreading like fire in dry grass. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others frowned deeply, their eyes burning with judgment. To see a bride chained on her wedding day was strange enough, but to believe her father was behind it felt cruel and unthinkable. Kojo's eyes darted to Kwaku, searching for answers, but the man did not move. His lips were pressed tight, and his gaze never wavered from Amma. The silence between father and daughter screamed louder than any words. Amma's tears slid down her cheeks as if she could feel the weight of not only the chains but also her father's stern approval of them. The priest hesitated, his voice caught in his throat. The children whispered questions to their mothers, who hushed them quickly. Elders shook their heads slowly, muttering that such a sight could only mean a hidden truth was about to be exposed. The air grew heavier, and the joyful spirit of the wedding was now suffocated by doubt and suspicion. Kwaku finally lifted his chin, his posture defiant, as though daring anyone to question him. Yet, in the silence, the pain in Amma's eyes spoke louder than his silence. The people stared, their whispers filling the church with one question: why would a father humiliate his daughter in front of her husband, her family, and her entire village? Amma's steps grew slower as she dragged the heavy chains down the aisle, each clank echoing like thunder in the silent church. Her face was partly hidden by her veil, but through the thin fabric, her tears glistened. They rolled down her cheeks quietly, leaving marks of pain no one could ignore. She tried to keep her head high, but the weight on her feet forced her shoulders to bend. Every movement showed her struggle, every step spoke of her suffering. She held her bouquet tightly, her fingers trembling as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The priest stood at the altar, frozen with uncertainty. His hands, once steady with years of service, now shook slightly as he looked between Amma, Kojo, and Kwaku. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Should he go on with the ceremony as if nothing was wrong? Or should he stop and ask for answers? His hesitation was clear, and the silence that followed it pressed down on the entire congregation. The guests sat stiff, their eyes fixed on the bride. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Some women dabbed at their eyes, pitying her quiet suffering. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their jaws clenched in disapproval or fear. Children who once laughed before the ceremony now sat quietly, holding on to their parents, sensing that something dark was unfolding. Amma's tears fell freely now, not in loud sobs, but in silence that pierced deeper than any cry could. Each drop that touched her gown seemed to speak of secrets she carried, secrets she could not tell. Her silence was heavier than the iron around her ankles, and it forced the people to wonder what truth lay hidden beneath this painful sight. The priest finally lowered his head, as though surrendering to the moment. Everyone knew the wedding could not continue this way. The silence demanded answers. The truth, whatever it was, had to come out, for the chains were not just around Amma's feet, but around the heart of everyone watching. The heavy silence was broken when Kwaku Mensa suddenly stepped forward, his voice loud and trembling, shaking the air inside the church. "She cannot marry without the chains," he cried, his words echoing through the hall. The crowd gasped, startled not only by the volume of his voice but by the weight of his claim. All eyes fixed on him, waiting for an explanation. His hands shook, yet his stare was hard as stone. He pointed toward his daughter, his voice cracking as he spoke again. "Amma is cursed, a curse buried deep in our family. If she dares to marry freely, without those chains binding her, death will follow." Gasps turned into murmurs, the guests whispering fiercely among themselves. Some clutched their beads, their lips moving in urgent prayers, believing his words without question. A few women broke into quiet cries, pitying the young bride caught in such a fate. Others frowned, shaking their heads, convinced Kwaku had lost his mind. How can a father speak such things on his daughter's wedding day? An elder whispered, his voice heavy with doubt. Alma stood frozen, her tears flowing harder, her body trembling under the shame of her father's words. Kojo's heart pounded, his eyes darting between Alma and her father, refusing to believe what he was hearing. His love told him this was madness, but the fear in the guests' eyes told him they believed otherwise. The priest looked shaken, his lips parting but no words coming. His face revealed both shock and recognition, as if some hidden part of him understood what Kwaku meant. The chains clinked as Alma shifted, and the sound seemed to agree with her father's declaration, pressing fear deeper into the hearts of all present. The church was now divided, some nodding their heads in belief, others whispering that Kwaku was cruel or insane. But no matter what side they chose, one truth was clear: the wedding had turned into something far darker than celebration. What was meant to unite two hearts now carried the shadow of death. Kojo could no longer stand still. His chest heaved with anger and love as he rushed forward, his footsteps echoing across the church floor. The guests gasped, some rising from their seats, as he knelt before Alma. Her chains rattled as he touched her feet, his hands trembling with desperation. He looked up at her tear-streaked face and then back at her father, his voice breaking with emotion. "I don't care about curses," he declared, his words fierce and clear. "I love her, and I will free her, no matter what." His hands moved quickly to the iron shackles, his fingers searching for the lock. He pulled at them with all his strength, his teeth gritted, his heart beating wildly. But the moment his skin touched the metal, he let out a sharp cry. The chains grew hot, burning into his flesh as though they were alive. He yanked his hands back, his palms red and blistered, pain shooting through him. The people screamed, some covering their faces, others murmuring that this was proof of the curse. Alma bent down, her eyes wide with fear, reaching for Kojo's hands. "Stop, please," she whispered, her voice broken. Tears dripped onto his burned skin as he shook his head stubbornly. "No, Alma," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "These chains will not hold you forever. I will fight them, even if they burn me 1,000 times." The priest stepped closer, his face pale, murmuring prayers under his breath. The guests whispered in panic, some shouting that Kojo was brave, others saying he was foolish for defying the spirits. The sight of the iron glowing faintly where his hands had touched sent shivers through the crowd. Kojo stood again, his fists clenched despite the pain. He placed himself between Alma and her father, his voice steady and strong. "No curse, no chain, no fear will take her from me," he declared. His words echoed through the church, a vow not just to Alma, but to everyone watching, a vow that love was stronger than fear. The church grew tense as Kojo's words still echoed in the air. Everyone's eyes turned to the old priest, Father Mensa Boteng, who stood quietly, his wrinkled hands gripping the edges of the altar. His face was pale, his eyes filled with something deeper than shock, recognition. Slowly, he stepped forward, his long robe brushing the floor, and raised his trembling hand for silence. "I have seen chains like these before," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying through the hall. The crowd hushed instantly, hanging on his every word. He moved closer to Alma, his gaze fixed on the iron shackles biting into her skin. He bent slightly, whispering a prayer under his breath, then looked back at the people. "These are not ordinary chains," he continued. "They are spiritual, forged not by blacksmiths, but by words spoken in anger, by curses rooted in blood. Such chains are tied not to punish the body, but to enslave the soul." Gasps rippled across the church. Mothers clutched their children tighter, elders nodded slowly, recognizing the priest's warning. Alma shivered as his words sank into her heart. Kojo stared in disbelief, his fists still clenched, refusing to accept that love alone could not break what bound her. The priest's eyes darkened as he went on. These chains were not placed by strangers. They were tied by someone within her own family. Someone who sought control, someone who wished to punish or destroy her happiness. His words hit the room like a storm, and people began to murmur loudly, suspicion darting from one face to another. Alma turned her head toward her father, her lips trembling but unable to speak. Kwaku's eyes narrowed, his face stiff, as if hiding something too heavy to confess. The priest lifted his hand again, silencing the whispers. "The question before us," he said solemnly, "is not whether she is cursed, but who among her bloodline placed this burden upon her." The church fell into a fearful silence, for the truth was now closer than ever, yet far more dangerous. Kwaku's stern face finally cracked. His lips trembled, and his eyes, once cold and unyielding, filled with tears he could no longer hold back. The entire church watched in silence as his chest rose and fell heavily, like a man fighting against years of buried truth. At last, his voice broke, raw and heavy. "Yes, it is true," he confessed, his words trembling. "When Amma was just a baby, a curse was spoken over her. A jealous relative, consumed by envy, declared that she would never walk into happiness freely, that every step toward joy would be bound in chains." Gasps filled the hall, some people clutching their heads in disbelief. Mothers wept softly, pitying the young bride who had grown up under such a shadow. Kojo's fists tightened, his jaw clenched as anger mixed with sorrow. Amma's tears fell harder, her body shaking as she heard the words that explained a lifetime of hidden pain. Kwaku's shoulders slumped as he continued, his voice breaking with guilt. "I did not create the curse, but I have lived in its fear. I believed if she walked into her marriage without these chains, the curse would strike harder, maybe take her life. I forced the chains on her not to humiliate her, but to protect her. To remind her of the danger that followed her since birth." His voice faltered, and he buried his face in his hands, weeping openly before the whole village. The whispers grew louder, some condemning him for enslaving his own daughter, others nodding in sorrow, understanding the fear that had ruled his heart. The priest lowered his head, his eyes heavy with pity, while Amma's body shook with sobs. Her pain was not just from the chains on her feet, but from the truth that her own father had chosen fear over faith, chaining her spirit for all these years. The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone knew the secret was finally uncovered, but the weight of it pressed harder than the iron around Amma's ankles. The question now lingered, could love and faith break what fear had kept alive for so long? The church remained heavy with silence until Father Mensa Botang stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. He lifted a small flask of holy oil from the altar, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. "Fear has bound her long enough," he said, his eyes sweeping across the congregation. He knelt before Amma, touching the chains gently, then raised the oil high. He prayed loudly, calling upon God to break every curse, every tie of darkness that held her bound. His words filled the church like thunder, and the people joined in, their voices rising in prayer and song. He poured the oil over the iron shackles, and instantly the chains rattled violently. The guests gasped as smoke rose faintly where the oil touched the metal. The priest pressed his palm on the lock, whispering one final prayer, and with a sudden crack, the chains burst open and fell to the ground. The sound of iron hitting the floor echoed like freedom itself. Amma fell to her knees, her tears now mixed with relief. Her hands reached out to the broken chains as if to believe they were truly gone. She sobbed into her palms, no longer the tears of shame, but of freedom she had long been denied. Kojo rushed to her side, lifting her gently, holding her as the church erupted with cheers. Women cried out in joy, children clapped their hands, and men raised their voices in praise. The dark shadow that had hung over the wedding lifted, replaced with a light that filled the entire village. Kwaku stood apart, his face wet with tears. He covered his mouth, his body trembling as he realized the truth. All along, it was his fear that had enslaved his daughter. He thought he was protecting her, but he had been the very chain that weighed her down. His sobs broke through the noise as he whispered, "Forgive me, my child." The priest raised his hand once more and spoke, "Sometimes the heaviest chains are not the ones on our feet, but the ones built by fear within families." The lesson echoed deeply, a truth no one would ever forget.